Hi guys, Mr. Halp here, and today is lesson 3D on the subject of the three methods of integration. Hopefully what you're going to find today is a lot of review and recap from previous English classes. The essentials, the basics of what I'm talking about today aren't anything too earth-shattering or new for you guys. However, maybe I can also give you guys some situations or some scenarios that might reveal sort of when these particular methods are more appropriate than others in a way that'll help you with your rhetoric as you continue to move through this course. So obviously the last time around we were talking about synthesizing these sources, weaving them together in a way that contributes to the great big conversation, that adds to it, that explores it in new and innovative ways by taking that information from other sources. The question is, though, how do we plug it in, okay? And the three major ways that we plug it in, as you can see, the three methods of integration, again, are ones that you're familiar with. You can quote it, you can summarize it, you can paraphrase it. I'm sure you've heard those words before, and I'm sure you could probably give a at least serviceable definition of all of them. But we want to use them at the right time. That's really what this is going to get more to the bottom of. When is the right time to quote, the right time to summarize, the right time to paraphrase in a manner that best serves the rhetoric of whatever it is we're trying to argue. So that's what this lesson is all about. So without any further ado, let's dive into this if you don't mind. So we start, of course, with quotations. So when you're trying to take something out of a source and plug it into a text of your own, you have the option, of course, of quoting it. So these are passages of text that are identical to the original source, indicated by the presence of quotation marks, okay? So you know this, you do this all the time. I'm sure it's familiar to you. At least that component of this is very familiar to you. If you want to use the exact words of a source, then you need to make sure you put it in quotation marks, have it word for word, make sure we know what source it's coming from and things of that sort. That's what quotations are all about, okay? So we come over here and we have our second thing then, which is quotations should be used when the source says something better than you are capable of saying it. And I'm going to throw a little caveat in there that's going to come back to us as we're talking about summaries and paraphrases. So yeah, a lot of times you're going to encounter sources that say something or cover something or use a turn of phrase that is better than any turn of phrase you could possibly come up with. If that's what you feel about that particular passage, then that's one of those ones you want to quote, okay? You don't want to take one of those ho-hum passages that, you know, it says something adequately or it doesn't particularly move you or you think you could say it better. But you do want to make sure that if they say it pretty darn good and you can't say it any better, quote it. That's the right time to do it, okay? Now, on the flip side of that, I get a lot of students who think to themselves, but Mr. Halp, these are published authors. There's no way I'm going to say something better than they say something. And my response to them is, that is not even remotely close to being half true, okay? For the simple fact that, especially as we're getting into, you know, AP and collegiate synthesis, as we are in this stage of the game, you're going to be getting a lot of sources that are written by college professors. And yes, college professors are, ideally speaking, supposed to be pretty gosh darn smart. But don't forget that they're pretty gosh darn smart within their field of expertise. Most professors in a college institute aren't going to be English professors, meaning they can write adequately, they can't write perfectly, they can't write poetically, they can't write beautifully. And a lot of times they can't write in a manner that is comprehensible to a layman who isn't another professor in their field. So when I say to sort of be on the lookout for passages that are ones that say something particularly well and some that you can say better than what that original author said, those exist, and they're probably more prevalent than you would think that they exist, okay? Some other things to keep in mind about quotations: they are essential when discussing the language of the source. So if you're specifically talking about, case in point, how Shakespeare uses verbs, if you're specifically talking about how George Orwell constructs complex sentences, if you're specifically talking about the type of dialogue and slang words that are used in a F. Scott Fitzgerald book, those kinds of things, you would need to quote those. You don't just want to summarize how F. Scott Fitzgerald uses slang and dialogue. You want to quote. Okay, you want to quote that. You want to make sure that we know exactly what it is that he said. So if you're talking about language, and this is obviously a point that's very integral and important back to the rhetorical analysis component of this course, you want to actually quote it. Because if you think about rhetorical analysis, you're going to be talking about word choice and syntax and figurative language in a lot of situations, as you've already started to do. In a lot of those cases, quoting is the best choice, okay? Remember also, as we've talked about before, primary sources are written by individuals who witnessed and experienced an event, and therefore we probably want to quote them. As I said, we give a little bit more weight to primary sources. We assume that encapsulates sort of the era in which it was written and lived and so forth. So there's a better chance that if you have a primary source, you're probably going to want to quote it. Obviously, you can't only quote it, in which case your entire essay would turn into quotes, but you might give, 55% quotations as opposed to other options in that case, okay? That takes us, of course, down to summaries. What are summaries? Well, a restatement of information in your own words that is concerned only or primarily with the main idea of the passage. So if you think about it, if anybody ever said to you something like, summarize it for me, well, you know what that means. That means take what happened and boil it down to just the main idea, the simplest possible component that you could use to describe it. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about summaries, okay? So just like we talked about a couple moments ago, a summary would be a great thing to use when you can say it better than that original source said it. So that's something that you'll want to keep in mind. Also, as a corollary to go along with that, well, primary sources have the advantage of being written by people who experience them, and secondary sources do not, which is one of the reasons why if you've got a summary, remember, a summary is something that's in your own words, and if it's in your own words, it's not in the original words of the source, you might be more predisposed to use a summary rather than a quote whenever you're dealing with a secondary source. Because again, that immediacy, that experiential nature of someone who lived it firsthand isn't present, okay? And finally, I have this last little bullet point under summary here specifically so that we can use this as the basis for differentiating it from paraphrasing, which I know a lot of people have a lot of difficulty with. It says, remember that summaries reduce content rather than maintain it, meaning that they will always be the shortest of the three. So if I have a sentence that's a quote, and I quote that sentence, well, it's going to be the same length. The quote and the original sentence are going to be the same length. If I take that quoted sentence and I summarize it, well, chances are it's going to be a little bit shorter because I'm getting rid of all the facts and details and just focusing specifically on the main idea. Now, let's compare and contrast that with what we have down here under paraphrase, okay? So paraphrasing is a faithful one-to-one restatement of a passage in your own words, including all of the original details as well as the main idea. So really, when it says one-to-one, it's really saying it's kind of equal to a quotation, just in different words. And that's also why, to use that analogy I used a couple moments ago, if I have a quote, a sentence that's a quote, and I summarize that sentence, it's going to be shorter. If I quote that sentence, it's going to be the exact same length. And if I paraphrase it, it probably won't be exactly the same length, but it's going to be kind of close because it's in your own words, but it's also got all of those original details and the main idea as well. So it's got all of the same stuff that you would have had there, okay? So that's the thing to keep in mind as we get into paraphrases. They should be used when you can say something better than the source, than what the source originally said. We talked about that already with summaries. Again, this is the second thing that's in your own words. So you need to be asking yourself, can I write something better than this, or is this as good as it gets? And that'll help you determine paraphrase or quotation. Just like we talked about before, secondary sources would be a good choice for paraphrases because they're not quite as significant in terms of language and testimonial as a primary source would be. And here's that distinguishing feature, because I get a lot of students who, even the test day, they'll come up to me and say, but wait, what is the difference between summary and paraphrase? Well, this is the sentence that really is there to reiterate what the difference is. Unlike summaries, paraphrases do not reduce content, but rather maintain it, meaning they will be about as long as the passage they are paraphrasing. So again, summaries get rid of all of the excess, focus on the main idea. Paraphrases said, yeah, we want to have the main idea, but let's keep that excess as well. And those are your key definitions for the three main types of integration that you could be using in your research, okay? Now, some other little details to think about on that subject. Remember, good rhetoricians will not over-rely on any one of these three approaches, but balance their inclusion throughout the essay. And that's an important thing. Okay, if I read one of your essays and it's just quote after 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 quote, or on the flip side, there are no quotes in it and it's all paraphrase, 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 that's an issue because it shows us that you don't really know when the right and the wrong time to use these is. You don't really have a good understanding of how they operate differently and how they can function rhetorically within the context of an essay. So a good rhetorician is going to not just quote, not just paraphrase, not just summarize, but do a little bit of all three, okay? The other thing to keep in mind, and we're going to come back to this at a later point in time, is all of them are using research. And what that means is every single one of them is going to require an internal citation, okay? Just to reiterate, and my hope is that you guys have a good command of this already as AP students, but just to reiterate, even if it's in your own words, it still needs an internal citation. That's why quotes and paraphrases and summaries all require internal citations. The reason being, of course, that you didn't come up with the idea, you didn't come up with maybe the data or the information or the perspective that's being demonstrated in that sentence. Sure, you came up with all the individual words, and that's why you don't have to put it in quotation marks, but you didn't come up with the idea itself. And for that reason, it's still going to need the internal citations. And finally, on that particular topic, just to talk a little bit about internal citations in advance of when we actually address them more studiously, I get a lot of students who look at citations as a bad thing. The way I describe it is a Band-Aid on a boo-boo. Stop thinking that way, okay? I get a lot of students who come up to me in a panic and say, but wait, Mr. Hub, if I understand this correctly, there's going to be like an internal citation all over my paper. There's going to be internal citations everywhere. And my response is, generally speaking, okay, so what? Okay, that's not a bad thing. A lot of people think about them as, like I said, a Band-Aid on a boo-boo. You made a mistake and you're fixing that mistake by giving a little bit of credit. Don't look at it that way. That's what this bullet number 6 is there to try to communicate to you guys. Think of them as an added element of ethos. And that's how I look at them as a English scholar myself, and that's how you should look at them as an academic yourself. Okay? The fact that I can look at that and say, oh, well, this student researched, and oh, it's that person's contribution to the great conversation. So, as it says here, when you have internal citations, it's awarding you and your evidence more credibility, aka more ethos. And that's obviously something that you want to have more and more and more and more of. So don't neglect it, don't ignore it, don't think, oh, those internal citations, it looks so sloppy all over my essay, because it doesn't look sloppy to somebody who's in academia, okay? Now, bringing it down to our last little section, so we're talking about all of these things relating to the three different methods of integration. Let's just dip our toes a little bit into using sources to appeal to an audience, because as we know, based on our study of the rhetorical situation and so forth, everything is ultimately got to be geared back to the audience. Sure, everything we do is to argue the thesis, but we also need to make sure that how we're arguing it is geared through that thesis towards the audience. So some things to keep in mind about this as we are integrating sources from our information from our sources into our research projects of any sort. The type of evidence and the way it is documented depends on the audience and the situation. And that's something that we don't normally think about, but is nonetheless rather important in the grand scheme of things. So, I have just a couple of phrases here, all that are just there for food for thought, okay? Some audiences won't care about technical terms or formal citations, some will. So you've got these groups of people who think, I want to know what the actual scientists say, or I want to know what the actual experts say. And I care that this has been cited in this peer-reviewed journal, or it was published in that particular book, or something along those lines. Well, you need to ask yourself, is that my audience, or is it not? Some audiences don't need the research that generated the conclusions, and some will. So one of the things we talked about before was talking about the methodology for uncovering research and information, and how you can talk about how your resources did that. Well, some people are going to say, I won't believe you until you tell me how this information was uncovered, the process and methodology by which it was learned. Well, okay, is your audience the kind that's going to care about that or not? Some audiences need current academic thinking summarized for them. Some don't. So if your audience is not an audience of experts in that particular field, again, we're coming back to the background. What background do you need to provide? What sort of current events do you need to illuminate for them to make sure that everything else you have to say makes sense? Or else they're going to be lost from the get-go and things aren't going to work. And keeping in mind, this is sort of the corollary of that, some audiences have prior knowledge on a topic and some don't, okay? So how much, where is that prior knowledge geared towards? What does the average person overlook or unaware of within the scope of that particular topic? And that should inform which information you're including and which information you're not. And then lastly, of course, some audiences recognize and are influenced by internal citations, some aren't. I can personally tell, it's very easy to tell, particularly among my lower level students here at Fleetwood, that there are a lot of students who not only don't care about internal citations, but are genuinely bothered that they exist. So that's obviously an audience who isn't going to be find it appealing that those internal citations are there. That's not going to lend you more ethos and credibility as a consequence of including them accurately and fully. So with that in mind, you need to remember your audience, okay? Some audiences legit aren't going to want them there. Is this audience, is that audience one of those or not? So just some food for thought to think about this, because as we integrate information more and more and more and more into our writing, we're going to have to repeatedly come to some kind of conclusion about, okay, well what kind of sources and details does that mean we end up putting in, okay? Here's the final thing to say about that, though. Regardless of the expectations of the assignment or the needs of your audience, you must always give credit where credit is due. That's just academic honesty. And I know, in that little passage that I was just mentioning there, it says, well, some audiences like internal citations and some don't. And that's true, and we all understand that, I hope. But the other thing is, you're basically stealing if you don't give credit where credit is due. So regardless of what your audience thinks and what your audience feels, you never want to put yourself in a situation where you could be accused of academic dishonesty, of plagiarism, of academic theft, whatever the case may be. And that means just making sure you give credit where credit is due. It might not look like the formal MLA format always asks it to look, but it will still be giving credit where credit is due. And that's something to keep in mind, okay? All right, so that is everything I wanted to say today on that subject. So obviously the big thing to think about in here is those three methods of integration. Whenever you're pulling information out of a resource, you can quote it, you can summarize it, you can paraphrase it. What you do should be the right way, as you best define right in that context, and you need to be thinking about which will be the method that best influences the rhetoric that I'm trying to present. Because if you're just, alternating, quote, now summary, now paraphrase, now quote, no summary, now paraphrase, well, then you're not thinking rhetorically minded enough. And you're going to end up missing the chance to use those choices in a meaningful and effective way. So as always, if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to talk about them in class with me. And I will see you shortly, guys.